The rain hammered against the thin roof of the tiny apartment, each drop a reminder of how fragile everything felt. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills she couldn't pay. The electricity would be next. After that, she wasn't sure. Rent was already overdue, and her landlord had stopped being patient. Across the room, her little boy lay curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a hole at the edge. He had fallen asleep, waiting for dinner that hadn't come. She pressed her hands to her face, swallowing back the frustration, the exhaustion, the helplessness. This wasn't the life she had imagined. She had once believed in happy endings, in dreams that came true. But now, every day was a battle just to survive. She had taken every extra shift she could, skipped meals so her son could eat, and still, it was never enough. Her phone buzzed. For a moment, she didn't want to look. Another bill reminder? A message from her boss about covering someone else's shift. But when she glanced at the screen, her breath caught. It was from him, the man who had promised her forever, then walked away the moment things got tough. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She hadn't heard from him in years. What could he possibly want now? Before she could decide whether to answer, her son stirred, mumbling in his sleep. She exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. He was the only thing that mattered. Whatever his father had to say, it didn't change the fact that she was alone in this. She had to find a way forward, with or without help. The next morning, she woke up to a freezing apartment. The electricity had finally been shut off. She wrapped her son in the warmest clothes she could find, then pulled on her worn-out coat. It didn't matter how tired she was, she had to find a way to fix this. By noon, she was sitting outside a cafe, using their free Wi-Fi to search for anything, any side job, any opportunity. That's when she saw it. A competition, an open challenge from a billionaire entrepreneur looking for fresh business ideas. The winner would receive funding, mentorship, and the kind of financial support that could change their life. Her heart pounded as she read the details. It sounded impossible. She had no background in business, no degree, no connections. But she had ideas she had been too afraid to chase because survival had always come first. She glanced at her son, sitting beside her with a crayon in hand, doodling on the back of an old receipt. If she didn't try now, then when? With shaky fingers, she began typing her application. She wrote about the struggles she faced, the problems she saw, and the solutions she believed in. She didn't have fancy words or a polished presentation, just raw honesty and determination. Days passed. The email came when she least expected it. She had been chosen for the next round. It felt unreal. She had spent so long being invisible, overlooked, struggling to get anyone to listen. And now? Now she was going to stand in front of some of the most powerful people in the world and prove she deserved a chance. But as she stepped into the towering glass building on the day of the pitch, doubt crept in. The other contestants were polished, confident, wearing expensive suits. She was just a single mom in borrowed heels and a second-hand blazer. The doors to the conference room opened. The billionaire himself sat at the far end of the long table, watching as she entered. He didn't look impressed. Her hands trembled as she clutched the note she had written on the back of an old grocery list. This was her moment. If she failed now, there wouldn't be a second chance. She took a deep breath. Then, with everything she had, she began to speak. But before she could finish, the billionaire interrupted her. His expression unreadable, he leaned forward and said something that made her stomach drop. Something that could change everything. That moment stretched into silence, thick and suffocating. The billionaire's sharp eyes studied her, waiting. She gripped the paper in her hands, but the words blurred. "What makes you think you can do this?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. Her throat went dry. She had expected tough questions, skepticism, but something about the way he said it hit deeper. The room felt colder. the weight of every struggle pressing down on her all at once. She glanced at the others in the room: investors, executives, people who had never missed a meal, never had to choose between food and rent. They weren't just doubting her idea. They were doubting her. She inhaled, trying to steady herself. "Because I don't have the option to fail," she said finally. "This isn't a hobby or a dream for me. It's survival." A murmur ran through the room, some intrigued, others unmoved. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against the table. "Survival isn't enough. Businesses don't run on desperation. They run on strategy. You have 5 minutes. Convince me." Her pulse pounded. 5 minutes. That was all she had. She pushed away the doubt and focused. She spoke about the struggles people like her faced: single parents, low-income families, those stuck in cycles they couldn't escape. She described the problem, not in corporate jargon, but in real stories, her own, and those of others she had met along the way. Then she laid out her solution. It wasn't fancy or complicated. It was practical, built from the ground up for people like her. A business that didn't just sell a product, but actually changed lives. When she finished, the room was silent again, but different this time. Some of them looked thoughtful, others unreadable. The billionaire studied her for a long moment. Then, without looking away, he said to his team, "Keep her in for the next round." She almost didn't hear it. The words felt distant, unreal. Then, slowly, it sank in. She had made it through. But the fight was far from over. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, workshops, and sleepless nights. She was competing against people who had empires, teams, resources she could only dream of. While they had investors and mentors guiding them, she had nothing but her own determination and the late-night research she squeezed in after putting her son to bed. She felt like an outsider at every event. Conversations swirled around her about markets, funding strategies, industry trends. She scribbled notes, absorbing everything she could, but deep down, she knew knowledge wasn't enough. And the billionaire? He remained distant, watching but never engaging more than necessary. She couldn't figure him out. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't exactly encouraging either. It was as if he was waiting for her to crack. One evening, after another exhausting workshop, she sat alone in the empty conference room, staring at the numbers on her laptop screen. No matter how she adjusted them, they didn't add up. A voice broke the silence. "You're doing it wrong." She turned. He was standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets. She swallowed. "Then tell me how to do it right." He didn't move. "Figure it out." Frustration flared in her chest. "I'm trying, but I don't have the resources everyone else does. I don't have a safety net. If I fail, you think they don't have pressure?" He cut in. "Some of them have shareholders breathing down their necks. Others are risking their reputations. You're not special because you're struggling." His words stung, but she held his gaze. "Maybe not. But I'm special because I won't quit." For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not quite approval, but not dismissal either. Without another word, he turned and walked out. That night, she stayed up until dawn, working, reworking, refusing to let doubt win. Days passed. The competition grew more intense. She could feel the weight of every decision, every presentation. She wasn't just fighting for a business, she was fighting for a future. Then one morning, she got a call. Not about the competition, about her son. Her heart nearly stopped as she listened. She dropped everything and rushed to the hospital, panic clawing at her chest. When she arrived, she found him in a hospital bed, small and fragile, hooked up to machines that beeped too loudly. She gripped his tiny hand, her body shaking. He had collapsed at school. The doctors were running tests. They didn't know what was wrong yet. Tears blurred her vision. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had been fighting so hard to build a future for him. What if? No, she couldn't think like that. She had to be strong. But as the hours passed, her mind spiraled. The competition, the meetings, the business, it all felt distant now. What did any of it matter if she couldn't protect him? A knock at the door made her look up. She never expected to see him standing there, the billionaire. He didn't say anything at first, just took in the scene. Then, in a voice quieter than usual, he asked, "What do you need?" She didn't know how to answer. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she could do this alone. She stared at him, unable to process why he was there. The billionaire, this man who had barely looked at her beyond the competition, was now standing at the door of her son's hospital room, asking what she needed. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She had spent so long fighting to survive on her own, carrying every burden without expecting help. But now, with her son lying so still in that hospital bed, the walls she had built around herself felt dangerously close to crumbling. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." He stepped inside, his usual coldness softened by something unreadable. "Then let's figure it out." She wasn't sure what he meant until, minutes later, a nurse appeared with an update. The hospital had run additional tests, ones she hadn't even asked for, because she knew she couldn't afford them. The nurse spoke carefully, explaining possible treatment plans, resources she hadn't known existed. And just like that, she knew. The billionaire had done this. She turned to him, searching his face for some kind of explanation. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at her son, watching his small chest rise and fall beneath the thin hospital blanket. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Not everything is about business. She wanted to press him, to demand more, but exhaustion pulled at her, the weight of the past few weeks crushing down all at once. So instead, she simply nodded, whispering, "Thank you." The next few days were a blur of waiting, of doctors coming in and out, of moments where fear nearly swallowed her whole. She barely touched her phone, ignoring messages about the competition, deadlines she knew she was missing. None of it mattered if her son wasn't okay. But then one afternoon, as she sat by his bedside, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a reminder or an update. It was a name she never expected to see. Her son's father. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the screen. He had abandoned them years ago, disappearing the moment things got hard. He had never called, never asked about his child. And now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out. 1,000 possibilities ran through her mind. Did he know about the hospital? Was this some cruel coincidence? She hesitated, then finally answered, "What do you want?" His voice was too casual, like he hadn't been missing from their lives for years. "I heard you've been doing well. Big competition, right? Looks like you finally figured out how to make money." She gritted her teeth. Of course. He didn't care about their son. He cared that she was finally getting somewhere. "If that's why you called, don't bother." But he ignored her words, his voice turning sharper. "You think you can just forget about me? That you can move on, and I won't come back?" Her blood ran cold. There was something in his tone, something that made her grip the phone tighter. "You made your choice," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "You walked away." He let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, and maybe I want to walk back." She clenched her jaw, glancing at her son. He was still asleep, peaceful and unaware. He didn't remember the nights she had cried, the way his father had left without looking back. "You don't get to do that," she said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." But as she hung up, unease crawled up her spine. She had spent so long clawing her way out of the life he left her in, so long learning how to survive on her own. But now, with the competition, the billionaire's attention, and the sudden appearance of the man she had once trusted, everything was shifting. And for the first time, she had the sinking feeling that just because she had left the past behind, didn't mean it had let go of her. She sat frozen, the weight of the phone still heavy in her hand. Her son's father had never cared before. Why now? What had changed? Her mind spun with questions she didn't have time to answer. All she knew was that the past had a way of creeping back when you least expected it, and she had a bad feeling this wasn't the last time she'd hear from him. A small stir from the hospital bed brought her focus back. Her son shifted under the covers, his eyelashes fluttering before his eyes slowly opened. Relief washed over her as she reached for his hand. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He blinked at her, groggy but alert. "Are we going home?" She forced a smile, not wanting him to see the storm raging inside her. "Soon, baby. Just a little longer." The doctor arrived shortly after, delivering cautious optimism. The worst seemed to be over, but her son needed rest, careful monitoring, and a follow-up in a few days. It wasn't a full victory, but it was enough for now. But as soon as she stepped into the hospital hallway, reality slammed back into her. The competition. The billionaire. The fact that she had missed too much already. If she didn't do something, all of her progress, all of the sacrifices, would slip through her fingers. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone, scrolling through unread messages. Then, with her heart pounding, she dialed a number she never thought she'd have to. The billionaire answered on the first ring. "You finally decided to call back." His voice held no anger, just something unreadable. She hesitated before speaking. "I need to know if I still have a shot." There was a pause. Then calmly, he said, "Come to my office. Tonight." She glanced back at her son's hospital room, torn between responsibilities. But deep down, she knew if she lost this opportunity, there might not be another. And if she won, she could build a future where moments like this weren't ruled by fear. So, later that night, she found herself standing outside his towering office building, nerves coiling tightly in her stomach. The city stretched around her, bright and alive, so different from the quiet world she came from. Inside, the air was crisp, the silence heavy. She was led to his office, where he stood by the window, looking down at the city lights. When he finally turned, his expression was unreadable. "You missed important rounds," he said. She straightened. "I know. You're behind. I know that too." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he walked over to his desk and tossed a file onto it. "Then prove why I should still consider you." She hesitated only for a second before stepping forward, flipping open the folder. Inside were reports, projections, everything about her business proposal, but there were also notes in the margins, scribbled in sharp, efficient handwriting. His handwriting. Her stomach tightened. He had been paying attention. Even when she thought she had lost her chance, he had been watching. Slowly, she looked up. "You're giving me a second chance." A slight smirk crossed his face. "I don't believe in second chances, but I do believe in unfinished business." Determination flared in her chest. She pulled herself together, ignoring the exhaustion, the fear, everything that had tried to break her. This was it, her last chance to fight. So she did. She pitched her idea with everything she had, speaking with the same raw honesty that had gotten her here in the first place. She didn't hold back, didn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. When she finished, the room was silent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Prepare for the final round." The words sent a shiver through her. This was the moment she had fought for. But deep down, she knew winning this competition wasn't just about business anymore. There were too many moving pieces, too many things lurking beneath the surface. And something told her that before this was over, she was going to learn exactly what unfinished business really meant. She left the office that night with her heart pounding, a strange mix of victory and unease settling in her chest. She had made it through to the final round, but something about the way the billionaire had said unfinished business stayed with her. It wasn't just about the competition anymore. She could feel it. There was something else beneath the surface, something she hadn't figured out yet. And then, just when she thought she could catch her breath, her phone rang. She didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Her son's father. She exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter before answering. "What do you want?" His voice was slow, deliberate. "I hear you're doing well. Moving up in the world." Her stomach twisted. He wasn't just calling to talk, he was circling, waiting for an opening. "I told you before, you don't get to come back now," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Not after everything." A low chuckle came through the line. "See, that's where you're wrong. You might think you've moved on, but legally, I still have rights." Ice shot through her veins. "What are you talking about?" "I did some digging. Turns out, I never actually signed away my parental rights." His tone was almost amused. "Which means I have a say in what happens with our son. Where he lives. Who he's with." Her breath caught. "You wouldn't, wouldn't I?" His voice dropped, and for the first time, she heard the threat underneath. "You think I don't see what's happening? You're about to win big. You're about to really make it. And I figure, if my kid's gonna have a billionaire mom, maybe I should be part of the picture. Unless..." He let the word hang. She gripped the phone, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Unless what?" "You make it worth my while." Her knees nearly buckled. This wasn't about their son. It had never been about their son. He wanted money, control, a way to get back into her life now that she had something he could take. Her fingers curled into a fist. "I'm not paying you." His voice turned cold. "Then I guess I'll see you in court." The call went dead. She stood there in the cold night air, her body shaking. He wasn't bluffing. If he actually pursued this, it didn't matter how absent he had been, she would have to fight. And the worst part, he knew she didn't have time for a legal battle. He knew she was pouring everything into this competition, that she was stretched thin. He was waiting for her to crack. By the time she made it home, her mind was spinning. She barely slept, every scenario playing out in her head. If he followed through with this, if he actually tried to take custody, it wouldn't just be a distraction, it could destroy everything. And the billionaire? Would he see this as weakness? A reason to counter out before the final round even happened? The next morning, she walked into the competition's headquarters, feeling like she was walking on a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. But then something unexpected happened. As she stepped into the main conference room, ready to face another day of proving herself, she noticed a shift in the air. People were whispering, casting glances in her direction. And when she turned the corner, she saw why. Her son's father was standing there, right inside the building, talking to him, the billionaire. Her breath caught in her throat. Her ex leaned casually against the desk, talking like they were old friends. And the billionaire, his expression unreadable, was listening. A slow dread crawled up her spine. This wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't just about business. This was war. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her son's father stood there, speaking with the one person who could change everything for her, the billionaire. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but the easy way her ex leaned in, the way the billionaire's face remained carefully unreadable, sent panic racing through her. Her ex wasn't just trying to take her son, he was trying to destroy her before she could even win. She forced herself to move, stepping forward, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "What are you doing here?" Both men turned to her. Her ex smirked, his eyes gleaming with something dark. "Just introducing myself," he said smoothly. "Since we have so much in common." She shot a look at the billionaire, searching his face for any sign that he saw through the manipulation. But his expression remained unreadable, his gaze flicking between them like he was putting together a puzzle. "You don't belong here," she said sharply. "You have nothing to do with this." Her ex sighed, shaking his head. That's not exactly true. We have a child together, and I think it's important that the people making decisions about your future know the full story. Her stomach twisted. You're lying. He shrugged. Am I? Or did you just leave out some details? She clenched her fists. He was trying to make her look unstable, irresponsible, like she wasn't fit to win. And the worst part? The billionaire was listening. She turned to him, forcing herself to stay calm. Whatever he's telling you, it's not the truth. For a long moment, the billionaire said nothing. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "Did you leave anything out?" She swallowed hard. "I told you what mattered." His gaze didn't waver. That's not an answer. Her ex smiled like he had already won. She knew this was a test. If she lost control, if she let anger or fear dictate her response, it would prove everything her ex was trying to paint her as. But if she let the billionaire think she was hiding something, she might lose anyway. So she did the only thing she could. She told the truth. "He walked out on us when my son was barely a year old," she said, her voice firm. "Never called, never cared. And now that I have a chance at something real, he wants to ruin it." She turned back to her ex. "But you don't get to do that. Not anymore." Her ex's smirk faltered just slightly. She pressed on. "You think you can use this competition to scare me? To control me? You don't even want custody. You just want to take away what I've built." For the first time, her ex didn't have a slick response. She turned back to the billionaire, heart pounding. "I didn't tell you because it had nothing to do with this. I built my business. I fought for every chance I got. And I didn't need him then, just like I don't need him now." Silence. The billionaire studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to her ex, his expression unreadable. "You should go." Her ex let out a short laugh. "You're taking her side?" The billionaire's voice was cool. "I'm taking the side of someone who actually built something." Her ex's face darkened, but he knew better than to push further. He gave her one last glare, before turning and walking out of the building. She let out a slow breath, barely able to believe it. But before she could fully process, the billionaire spoke again. "You still have the final round," he said. "Be ready." Something in his tone sent a chill down her spine. He had dismissed her ex, but not because he was protecting her. Because he wanted to see what she would do next. She had won this battle. But the war wasn't over yet. She stood there for a long moment after her ex disappeared, her heart still pounding. The billionaire had sent him away, but not for her sake, because he wanted to see what she would do next. The final round was still ahead, and she had no choice but to push everything else aside and focus. That night, after tucking her son into bed, she sat at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of her. She had worked too hard to let anyone take this from her. Not her ex, not her doubts, not even the billionaire's cold, unreadable gaze. This was her moment. The final presentation would determine everything. She knew the other competitors were ruthless, and the billionaire expected nothing less than perfection. But she had something they didn't. She wasn't just fighting for money or status. She was fighting for her son, for their future. The next day, she walked into the boardroom with steady steps, refusing to let her nerves show. The panel sat in a long row, the billionaire at the center, watching her with an expression that gave nothing away. She took a deep breath and started speaking. This time, she didn't just present numbers and projections. She told a story, the story of struggle, of survival, of building something out of nothing. She spoke about the nights she worked while her baby slept, about the moments she almost gave up but kept going. She didn't try to impress them with fancy words, she let the truth speak for itself. When she finished, silence filled the room. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. Then, after what felt like forever, he gave a small nod. "You've won." The words didn't sink in at first. She had spent so long fighting, preparing for setbacks, that the idea of actually winning felt unreal. She searched his face, expecting some kind of catch, but his expression remained unreadable. "That's it?" she asked. His mouth twitched slightly. "That's it." Relief, disbelief, and something like triumph crashed over her all at once. She had done it. She had won. The rest of the day passed in a blur of handshakes, paperwork, and congratulations. But through it all, one thought stayed with her. This wasn't just about the money. It was about proving to herself, to her son, and to the world that she was more than the circumstances she had been dealt. That night, she sat on the floor of her apartment with her son, watching him stack toy blocks into a tall tower. He looked up at her and grinned. "Mommy, I made a big building." She smiled, brushing a hand through his hair. "You did, baby." "And guess what? Mommy made one too." He clapped his hands, delighted, and she felt something settle in her chest piece. Her ex never called again. Maybe he realized he had lost the power he once held over her. Maybe he just didn't care enough to keep fighting. Either way, it didn't matter. A week later, she stood in her new office, looking out over the city. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Success came with its own challenges. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had built this life with her own two hands. And no one could take it away from her now.